Welcome to the GSMC Business News Podcast, the show dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning business, technology, and the stock market. Get a head start on the day as we keep you updated on the latest goings-on Wall Street, money, jobs, and technology. If you're looking for a podcast to keep you informed and ahead of the game in business, the GSMC Business News Podcast has you covered.
Welcome. You are listening to the GSMC Business News Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. My name is Maya, and I'll be your host for today. Thank you so much for listening into the show. I'm very excited to have you all here. We have a lot of really interesting stories to go over for you guys today. One of the themes that I would kind of like to follow for today's episode, not for every single story, of course, but for a lot of it, I want to focus on women in the workforce. Not only am I personally a woman in the workforce, but I think that it's a really timely thing to talk about, and I think it's important, and I just want to provide a little bit of insight on something that perhaps is not touched on frequently enough in other business podcasts. So today we will talk about a handful of events that are going on in women who are working in a variety of different fields of business. So some of these women, of course, are going to be involved in sports, which is a huge reason why it's making headlines and is coming up as something that's considered news. Not all of them are in sports, but we will be talking about a couple of women who are making very bold moves in sports business. So the first person that we would like to discuss is named Alyssa Nakken, and she has been hired as the first ever full-time female Major League Baseball coach. This was a recent move that was made by their manager, Gabe Kapler. And when he hired her, first off, she wasn't the only hire. There was Alyssa and another assistant coach. They are both hired as assistant coaches. The other person who was hired alongside her to work as an assistant coach is Mark Hallberg. So both of them do have quite a bit of background, actually, in the baseball industry. But Alyssa is, of course, the person that I would like to focus on. This has been a historic move on behalf of MLB and on behalf of sports in the United States. So we have a lot of pride in her, and I'm very happy for her making these moves. So let's talk a little bit about her background. Alyssa Nakken is her name. Alyssa did her undergraduate degree at Sacramento State, and while she was there, she played softball for their team, and she was a very successful softball player at Sacramento State. She was a 3-time all-conference first baseman. I do think it's kind of interesting that she's still called a baseman, even though she's a woman, but maybe it's a little excessive to go for the base woman. I don't know, base person. So anyways, she was 3-time all-conference first baseman for Sacramento State for their softball team. And then she was also 4-time academic All-American player. So these are both super huge accomplishments, just starting off the bat, no pun intended. But that was just from her undergraduate degree. Then she graduated from Sacramento State in 2012, and she further pursued her master's degree in sports management from the University of San Francisco. And of course, while she was at San Francisco, she was working for their baseball team as well. She graduated with her master's degree in 2015, but the year before that, beginning in 2014, she had already secured herself an internship working for the Giants. So with the Giants, with this internship, she was working on developing, producing, and overseeing their health and wellness initiatives for the Giants. So she had already gained quite a bit of background in the field before she began even looking at a position as a coach for the team. And obviously she has the credibility, she has the knowledge, she has the skill, and she has the likability in order to gain a position like this. So she actually was not the only woman to be considered for this role. The other person who was considered as a coach for the Giants team was also Rachel Balkovich, who began working as a minor league hitting coach in November of 2019. And it looks like she was also applying for the position of a coach, or assistant coach rather, for the Giants, but Alyssa was the one who was ultimately decided upon. The manager of the team, again, is named Gabe Kapler, and he gave a brief quote to Sports Illustrated regarding Alyssa and Mark, and he said, quote, "Alyssa and Mark are highly respected members of the organization, and I'm delighted that they will now focus their talents on helping to build a winning culture in the clubhouse," end quote. And a lot of his interview, just briefly, was basically about creating an atmosphere of extreme positivity and not just a feeling of a team, but really focusing on a unity of the people involved. So he was honestly not super focused on discussing the fact that Alyssa was the first woman to be hired as a coach in Major League Baseball. But I think that that's respectful as well. The fact that he didn't necessarily focus on, here is a woman in the field, or not necessarily in the field, but in the industry. And he kind of overlooked that, but in a good way, because as he overlooked that, it really did treat her with the kind of respect and dignity that was deserved. And instead of focusing on things like this, he focused on what her selling points are, what her strengths are, and focusing on them as a team, Alyssa and Mark together working as assistant coaches, and the goals that they're going to be aiming towards as assistant coaches. Now, in the past, the MLB was under a little bit of scrutiny about diversity, and I kind of emphasize a little bit because it really does depend on where you're coming from, but the Institute for Diversity and Ethics in Sports released a report for 2019 that gave sort of a grading system to different sports leagues as far as their diversification and their ethics, of course. So Major League Baseball actually fell relatively low on the scale and only earned a grade of a C. That is even lower than the NFL and the NBA, which is a little bit surprising to me, actually, just considering the cultures of these sports. But it turns out the NFL actually received a C+, so just a little bump above the MLB. And then the NBA received a B. So, I mean, this is a little bit surprising to me, but it's not completely out of line. It looks like in the MLB, women only make up 30% of their workforce. So that's a stark number. It's a surprisingly low number of women working in the MLB. So after kind of going through all of this for you guys, why is this important to a business news podcast? Why are we not focusing on a sports podcast and something that's so heavily focused on the MLB? The reason is because this is not about a team player. This is not Alyssa working as an athlete. This is Alyssa working as a coach. It's her working her way through her experience, her education, her credibility up into a high-level position as a businesswoman and as somebody who is working really through this very complex industry. So I just wanted to bring that to the forefront because I think that it's very important to focus on her accomplishments as somebody who's working as a businesswoman. And that's very important to culture and society. So we're very happy for her, and I'm excited to see her work, and hopefully she'll be able to take some initiative and do really great things with the team. So again, we are going to focus a little bit on women in the workforce for today. So we just focused a little bit on Alyssa Nakken, who is the first ever full-time female MLB coach. Congratulations to Alyssa. And up next, after the commercial break, we will be talking about Jen Welter, who was hired in 2015 as the first female NFL coach, and her upcoming appearance on the video game Madden. So hang tight during the commercial break, and we'll be right back.
Are you looking for a podcast that gives you all of the latest news from the world of finance? Then check out the GSMC Financial News Podcast. We'll delve into the ups and downs of the stock market, changes in the economy, and news from the world of real estate and technology. From breaking news on the New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ, or the overseas market, to updates on the bond market, if there's money to be made, we'll cover it on the GSMC Financial News Podcast.
Welcome back. You are listening to the GSMC Business News Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. My name is Maya. Thank you so much for listening in today. We're very happy to have you with us. So we just finished up talking a little bit about the MLB's recent hire, Alyssa Nakken, who is the first ever full-time female MLB coach. Congratulations to Alyssa, and thank you for breaking waves for us. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about Jen Welter, who was hired in 2015 as the first female to coach in the NFL. And that in itself is not news. Obviously, that's been around for 5 years. But at this point, Jen has made an appearance on the video game Madden, which for anybody who may not be familiar with Madden, it is a video game that essentially simulates playing football. Now, Welter has made an appearance in the game as a coach. Just like in real life, she is a coach for the NFL, but in the game, she also makes an appearance. And this is such an interesting thing. For some people, they thought, oh, this is another publicity stunt. For example, when she was hired for the Arizona Cardinals in 2015, a lot of people thought that it was a publicity stunt. And there might be a little bit of that feeling around her making an appearance in Madden as well. But I actually don't think so. I think that it goes deeper than that. So let's back it up a little bit and talk about when she first was hired by the Cardinals in 2015. And we'll actually take it a little further back. But like we said, a lot of people actually looked at her being hired as the first female coach in the NFL, and they thought, oh, this is a publicity stunt. This is just them trying to say something about their ability to have equality and their understanding of women and all these kinds of things. So it was not necessarily taken seriously, even when she was hired as the first NFL female coach. However, Welter had a lot of experience with football for most of her life. She won 2 women's championships with the United States, and she was a running back for the Texas Revolution of the Champions Indoor Football League. And playing as a running back for this league was kind of a big deal because it made her the second woman to play a position on a professional men's football team that was not the position of kicker or holder. So there had been a handful of women who had played on this league or on professional men's football leagues, and they typically had played positions like kicker or holder, but Welter was only the second woman in history to play a position on a professional men's football team as a running back or as anything that was not a kicker holder. She also holds a master's degree in sports psychology and a PhD in psychology. So not only does she have a very strong background in football, but she also has a very strong educational background. And I would go so far as to say she really knows what she's talking about, and she's certainly qualified for the position. So why is it important that she's making an appearance in a video game? This is a big deal for a handful of reasons, and actually Welter talks about it herself, speaking to a forum recently about diversification in football and in business, and she talks about how essentially women are not represented in the sense that they can see themselves in this game. So even if you are theoretically marketing towards women for, let's say that, because there are women who want to play video games. Let's put that out there as a baseline. Moving forward from that basic point, it is very difficult to market a game to women that doesn't show women in the game. It's almost like a sin of omission at this point, because you're losing a significant amount of potential marketing and potential business simply by not having those people represented. So her point in this forum was essentially what we just said right now, was basically because you don't see women in the game as players, you don't see them as sidelines, you don't see them as coaches, anything. So because they're not represented, they can't see themselves playing this game. And that does negatively impact their marketing ability and their business. So now that we have Welter playing in the game, I would like to see if that makes an impact on their sales as far as Madden itself goes. Potentially just her being available and being represented as a character in the game might actually increase their sales, especially if people talk about it. Word of mouth is probably the strongest form of marketing. And beyond that, definitely social media and the sharing of articles about this new release, etc. So that being said, I think that when women who play video games hear about this, it might change their perspective on it to the degree that it might be able to impact their sales. We'll see about it. So in the forum in which Welter was speaking, she was joined by the Toronto Raptors assistant coach, Brittany Donaldson. They were 2 of 4 women who spoke at the forum. But I think that Donaldson makes some really interesting points when she discusses her position. She was talking about how people frequently didn't believe her about her position or assumed that she worked in another area like ticket sales or something like that. And she said there's nothing wrong with that, but it was difficult for her to own her position, own her place, and start actually accepting her place and feeling like she belonged there. And I think that she makes a very interesting point about it. So her quote says, "You look at the majority of coaches who are men, and not a lot of them played at a very high level. But that's okay. I was predominantly coached by men my entire life, and they were wonderful coaches. But it's just something I ponder a lot. Why do we have to have that extra validation to even enter the space? Why do we have to say we played at this high of a level?" End quote. So I thought that this was a very interesting point that she draws up. Not only was she herself very credible, very experienced before she entered the industry, but Welter as well, just like we discussed a moment ago. And it is important to note this, that a lot of times for women, in order to get into a similar position, you have to work that extra mile just in order to break into any industry. And it doesn't have to be football. It can be engineering. It can be medical school. It can be working in sales. It could be really any field, and it just takes that much more. And I think at this point, I would like to speak to the women who may be listening and just let you guys know that it's worth it. And hopefully, if things start to work out to where we do have more diversification in different industries, then it won't require that extra mile. But at the same time, you should think about it as your job. You shouldn't be asking for less responsibility or less motivation or less anything. And if it takes more work and more effort to get there, then that just adds to your strength as a person. And that goes for everybody, honestly. No matter who you are, if you want a position in any industry, any business, any job that you might be interested in, and you feel like you just have to work so hard in order to get there, just think of it as a good thing. It's almost like when you're studying in school and someone else is making really good grades, but they're cheating and they don't know anything about the topic. Ultimately, if you spend the extra time and the extra effort in order to make your honest good grade, that speaks a lot about you, and it's going to enhance your performance and your ability in the workplace, no matter what you do. So I think that this is just an interesting thing to consider, what Donaldson points out, and all of the credibility that Ms. Welter has acquired for herself. And now that we see her being represented on Madden, I think that it might have an impact on the future of people and women who are working and trying to get to a certain position, because when we see more representation, we have the ability to hopefully break some barriers and see more diversification in the workplace and strengthen our workplaces, strengthen the marketing capabilities, strengthen the sales, strengthen the unity of people together who are working in order to build a better business and a better environment. So this will wrap up our story for today, the second story regarding sports business. So we are done with sports business, but we are not done with ladies. So next, after the commercial break, I want to talk about the female executive from Marriott who is teaming up with Airbnb, and she's going to take an interesting new approach to hospitality in merging Airbnb with Marriott. So stay with us after the commercial break and we'll be right back.
Do you work in the world of marketing and advertising? Are you a media buyer or the owner of an agency? Have you been looking for a podcast to help stay on top of all the goings-on of those worlds? The GSMC Marketing News Podcast is dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning marketing and advertising. Get the latest marketing news, from what major businesses have planned for the coming year to the newest trends in advertising, from podcasts, digital and streaming, to the old standbys of radio, television, and billboards. The GSMC Marketing News Podcast has you covered, whether you're a marketing agent or a business trying to expand your brand.
Welcome back. You are listening to the GSMC Business News Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. My name is Maya. Thank you so much for listening to the show today. I hope you guys are having a lovely day. So we just got done talking a little bit about Jen Welter making an appearance on the video game Madden and how that kind of impacts women in the workforce and what that means for them, how it potentially could impact Madden sales, and what it means for women trying to break their way into difficult industries such as the NFL. So now I want to talk about Marriott. Marriott is working on something very interesting that they've actually started a while back. So in April of 2019, Marriott unveiled its pilot program called Homes and Villas. Homes and Villas was essentially an idea that was brought forth by a handful of people and led by an executive of the company, Stephanie Lenartz. She is their global chief commercial officer. And Stephanie Lenartz has been working on this Homes and Villas project in order to not necessarily team up with Airbnb, but rather than beating out the competition by just strictly sticking with hotel reservations, they wanted to latch on to that idea of home rentals and take it in a new direction with Marriott. Marriott has been the largest hotel chain in the world for quite some time, and they are doing very well. But I think that this is a brilliant venture for them because it allows for so many different things. So home rentals are really important, and when Marriott did a recent survey from their most loyal customers, they found that a significant number of their customers had decided to stay in a home of some sort, done some sort of home rental within the last year of traveling. So that lends us to believe that they are missing out on a huge amount of profit just because of not being a part of that market. Well, now Marriott is taking advantage of that information and starting to branch out in a new way. So the Homes and Villas project includes over 5,000 rentable, what they call premium and luxury homes, and these are located across 190 different locations around the world. It's a very interesting market because it's not the same as a hotel room. So if you consider different scenarios like a family reunion or a longer stay vacation, then it might be more appropriate for people to book a home rental rather than a hotel room. For example, my family reunions can be very large, and when I considered this, I thought, actually, this might be more accommodating for a large group, such as a family reunion, rather than a hotel room, because it creates a more welcoming, unified space for people to spend time together. It's definitely easier to manage the booking rather than having to work with individual hotel rooms, and a lot of times it can be more cost effective. Now, another aspect of this that I thought was interesting is the availability of spacing. A lot of times because of zoning regulations and whatnot, hotels are only available in certain locations, but the home rentals can allow for different locations, like maybe something off the usual path. So if you're doing a hiking trip, for example, and you want to stay out in the mountains, then it provides for that possibility, whereas it would be much more difficult to accomplish the same task or the same goal through a hotel rental. The other thing that they found was that the majority of people who booked for homes were staying longer. For example, most people who did a home booking stayed for over 5 days in their reservation. Whereas a hotel booking, the average hotel stay is 1 to 2 days. So just the sheer length of the stay is significant as far as confirmation of booking, the security of booking, and just the ability to make sales. So it really does draw in a very interesting and reliable market of people. Now, Airbnb really did a great job of appealing to younger generations through their marketing, primarily because they worked with apps and made it available through technology. So Marriott is working on making this a very technologically friendly aspect of their business as well, but it's also it's also important to identify that the millennial generation is not the only one who's going to be interested in this service. Part of that might just be because of customer loyalty or brand recognition, but it looks like actually the demographic that is strongly interested in the Home and Villas project happens to be around the 50 to 64-year-old age group, which is excellent for Marriott because in a lot of cases, those tend to be more reliable customers. So this is a really interesting project for them. Hopefully it works out really well. Again, the pilot was unveiled in April of 2019, but at this point they are making it a permanent fixture as a part of Marriott's services. So we can look forward to that. And if you are interested in booking a home stay rather than a hotel booking, then consider Marriott perhaps for your next traveling venture. If you're looking for something like that, Airbnb is no longer your only option. So this was just a little touch on some moves that Marriott is making in terms of upgrading their options for hospitality and travel. So up next, we will talk about a little bit of negotiation tactics and why strong-arming might not be in your best interest when it comes to negotiating. It looks like soft negotiations have recently come to the light. So stick with us after the commercial break and we will be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back. You are listening to the GSMC Business News Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. My name is Maya. Thank you so much for listening to the show today. So we just wrapped up a quick story about Marriott and how they are taking on some new projects with their Homes and Villas project that allows them to reach out into the home rental aspect of hospitality marketing, and allows them also to compete with Airbnb on a certain level. So now we want to talk about some negotiation tactics. So this, I think, is useful advice for anybody, anywhere, whether you see yourself as a negotiator or not. Fundamentally, almost every interaction that you have in a business setting is going to be a negotiation of some sort. Even if you are asking a coworker to hand me some files, or can you make some copies of this, or anything. You might be asking for a raise. You might be hiring somebody and negotiating their hours or their terms of hiring, terms of employment. There are so many situations in which we're negotiating, even those situations in which we don't approach it with the negotiation mentality. So I think this is a very interesting thing to discuss here. So let's begin. We have a couple of people, Maurice Schweitzer and Inav Hart. Both of them are researchers and professors who work for Wharton, and they conducted a study that yielded a paper. And in this paper, it's called Getting to Less When Negotiation Harms Post-Agreement Performance. In this paper, they discuss their experiments, how they conducted the experiments, and what the results were. And ultimately, the bottom line is that when negotiations are brought about with this kind of typical strong-arm, assertive, nearly angry approach to negotiating, it yields less beneficial or less desirable results after the negotiation process. And really, the fundamental message here is that the way that we go about negotiating is just as important as what we gain from the negotiations. So if our goal is to, for example, settle on a price for a product that's being offered. Let's say that you are trying to offer a product to a vendor and you want to sell to them for a certain price, and you want to make the best profit, of course, that you can, but they would prefer to purchase for a lower price because that affects their profits. That's a basic example. If we put it into this situation, we really need to focus during this negotiation process equally on the relationship that we're forming and the terms of the agreement. So not only are we looking for the best deal, the best terms, etc., we want the negotiation to result in terms that are going to benefit us. But we also need to put in a little bit of foresight into the relationship that we're building and how it's going to play out in the future. Because really, a lot of literature at this point that describes negotiations focuses on winning, on getting the best deal for yourself, focuses on getting the bigger piece of the pie. But a lot of them don't focus on the relationship and the future business that's going to ensue after the negotiation. They stop at the point of, did you win or did you not? And really what we're looking at from Wharton's experiments is the behavior that ensues after negotiation and how it affects the business relationship. So, for example, in some of their studies, they watched some interactions between employees and employers. So they had a section of people. One group negotiated for a salary and then went to work. The other group did not negotiate for their salary. They were given a non-negotiable salary and just, here you go. There's your salary and here's your job. And when they studied these two groups, even if the resulting salary was the same, they found that those who negotiated for their salary, the employees who negotiated for their salary, ended up working less and being less productive after the terms of the negotiation were met. On the other hand, the employees who were given just a straight number, no negotiation, here is your salary, those employees had a much stronger tendency to work harder after the negotiations. So what does this tell us about the relationship that's formed and how the negotiations were handled? It tells us a lot. It tells us that sometimes it's best to negotiate and sometimes it's not best to negotiate. For example, from the perspective of the employer, in this situation, it was best for them not to negotiate at all because they would have ended up with the same number, in theory, the way that this experiment was set up. They ended up with the same number. However, afterwards, the relationship was so much different. And that's the part that I want to focus on now. The relationship between these two people is significantly altered by not only the fact that there was or was not a negotiation put into place, but also how the negotiation went about. The negotiation and the conversation that goes on between two people in this kind of interaction is very, very important. So when you have this employee-employer situation, for example, the employee no longer thinks, okay, I am an employee and here's my boss, and we have a working relationship. If they enter into negotiation over their salary, then potentially the reason why they end up working less or less efficiently could be because they no longer see this person as a working relationship, but they see it as a competitive relationship. And when you change that dynamic, it can change the structure of how they view their workday. So we need to put a little bit of forethought into place in that situation. And that could be the case not only with a regular employee, but it could be maybe a babysitter or a plumber or anybody who you have that kind of interaction with. We can also look at this in more structured negotiation terms. So for example, you work out a business deal. Let's go back to the seller and the vendor, right? So I suppose you could say a distributor and a vendor. So if the distributor is trying to present their product to the vendor and both of them are negotiating prices, you eventually come out to rebates, prices, terms of agreement, all of these things, and all of the logistics that go into it. So there's a lot of different aspects of this deal, right? When you have a very difficult negotiation process, and perhaps two people who go by the same classic literature on negotiations, which is to come in, be assertive, start with a high number, maybe assert a little bit of anger in your conversation. When you have an interaction like this, it creates a different working relationship from that point forward. So perhaps you actually do end up with the terms of agreement that you set out to achieve. But from that point on, do you have a good working relationship? Do you have respect between those people? Do you have a flow of business that is desirable between the two parties involved? These are all things that Wharton is looking at, and I think that they drew a lot of conclusions that were very useful in analyzing the way that people work together, because when we come up with their research, it turns out that it very frequently is more beneficial to come at things from the approach of a long-term vision, rather than simply aiming for the bottom line negotiation benefits that you're looking for, rather than just looking for the terms of the deal that you're seeking. They discovered that it was much more beneficial in the long run to consider forming a relationship rather than simply starting an argument or trying to achieve what you want out of a conversation. So that hopefully was a little bit of helpful advice, something to kind of tumble over in your brain for a little bit for a couple of days. We have another commercial break coming up, and when we come back, I want to talk a little bit about the CES of 2020. Last episode, we talked about this just a little bit, and some of the innovations and new technology that Samsung was bringing to the table. So this time, I would like to talk a little bit about some cars and brands that are really testing the boundaries of innovation. So stay with us during the commercial break, and we'll be right back to talk about the CES of 2020.
Are you tired of the same old news? Are you sick of the seemingly endless political spin and negativity? The GSMC America's Still Beautiful podcast is a weekly news podcast covering all the top positive and uplifting news stories. We cover stories that will inspire, uplift, and remind you of the good in the world. Tune into the Golden State Media Concepts America's Still Beautiful podcast to get all the great and positive news stories of today. Download the GSMC America's Still Beautiful podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back. You are listening to the GSMC Business News Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. My name is Maya. So we just went over a little bit of negotiation tactics, sort of, and talked about why it might be more beneficial to take a more relaxed approach to your negotiations the next time you enter into a conversation, and how it could be beneficial in some cases to even not negotiate. So next, I want to follow up on the Consumer Electronics Show, CES, as previously referred to. The Consumer Electronics Show of 2020 just took place, and in the last episode, we talked about some potential things that Samsung was bringing to the table at the CES of 2020. And Samsung brought some very interesting things like an AI kind of infused technology that could help you type on a QWERTY keyboard on your smartphone. And it basically just read your fingers' movements and converted that movement to an input on the phone that would allow the QWERTY keyboard to be utilized on the phone. And you could use it on a phone, a tablet, even a laptop. So now we want to look at some other things that were brought up at the CES of 2020. I want to go over a couple of different cars that were brought up. Most of these are concept cars, but some of them are also for sale. So the first one is from Mercedes-Benz. This one is, out of the ones that I saw, the most intriguing and has some really wild elements to it. So let's take a look. The Mercedes-Benz concept car that was brought to CES is called the Mercedes-Benz Vision AVTR. And this car is really incredible. It does some things that I don't thoroughly understand from a technology perspective, just simply because it's so innovative and I'm not sure how they made it work. But essentially, this car is trying to merge human and machine into one. And it's quite incredible. Somehow, the car will recognize the driver or the user by their heartbeat and breathing patterns. So when you enter the car, it recognizes you and it picks up on your body based on, just subtle things like that. Then you have a menu of sorts that is projected somehow onto the user's hand, onto the driver's hand. So on the palm of your hand, a menu is visible. And then by mere thought, the driver is able to select through the menu and give different instructions to the car. So I don't know if it's thought-based or if it's based on movements on the palm. I'm not entirely sure, but the goal here is so that the driver can utilize simply thoughts. They're recognized by the machine, and then they use their thoughts in order to direct the car. This is really wild to me. Never heard of anything like this, but it sounds incredible. And I would love to see if it actually functions smoothly. And I don't think that this is going to be street legal for any period of time. But it would be very interesting to test the safety protocols on this and see how efficient it is, how smooth the technology is, as far as reading thoughts from a person and converting that into driving a car. It's pretty incredible. The other thing that it does, which I love this, the wheels can turn up to a 30-degree angle so that the car can essentially drive sideways. This is something that I've been thinking about since I was a child, because I would always park in one parking space and, I wish that I could slide over because somebody just moved into, wherever, or they just left the space next to me. So being able to drive essentially sideways is incredible, and I'm glad that they finally brought that into play. This Mercedes car was also designed with the creators of Avatar 2, which is being released later this year. So that kind of gives you a little bit of a feel for what the car might look like. It's incredibly futuristic looking. It's got glowing lights on the inside and on the outside. It's got kind of this bioluminescent feeling about it because it looks very curvy, very sleek, but almost resembling elements of nature in the curves and the design of the car. So it's a beautiful creation. So the second one that I want to talk about is from Fiat. This is the Fiat Centoventi. This number means 120 in Italian, and it's kind of a celebration of Fiat's 120th anniversary. So this car is really focusing on customization. It's very interesting because it comes as almost like a blank canvas of a car. It's just silver. It has the same basic body design as most Fiats that you might see on the road. So it's not super shocking as far as the initial face value of it, but the customization process that they incorporate is very interesting. So when you purchase the car, you have a blank, like I said, blank canvas of a car, and then you also have a combination of panels, bumpers, etc. that you can change out. And every person who purchases this car gets 4 different color combinations on top of the blank canvas of a car. So you have all of these different ways to customize the car. Then on the screens well, I shouldn't say screens, on the windows of the car. They essentially incorporated a screen so that you can have sort of like a high-tech interchangeable method of displaying perhaps like a bumper sticker or some sort of message on the window of the car that's visible only from the outside. The final car that I want to describe quickly is coming from Sony, which is interesting because Sony doesn't typically produce cars. And unfortunately, this one is not really planning to be mass produced, even though it is designed to actually be used on the road. So when you look at this one, this is the Sony Vision S, and it actually is designed to look not so much different than most other cars that you see on the road. In my opinion, it kind of resembles a Tesla a little bit on the front end of the car, but really it's not super outstanding as far as the body design goes. But this one is just a prototype, the one that was revealed at CES 2020. But the big thing about this car is the technology that they put into the inside of the car. So the outside is really nothing super shocking, but on the inside of the car, we've got cameras, telecommunication technology, sensors, all kinds of things. It is also 536 horsepower. It is a 4-seat sedan, and it goes from 0 to 60 in under 4.8 seconds. And that is according to Sony. Of course, they did not test that at CES 2020. So these have been some of the innovations and presentations that were brought up in CES 2020 as far as cars go. There are so many other things that were presented at CES 2020. Like we said, Samsung was coming out with some very interesting technology. But that will wrap up this segment. So we have one last commercial break. And when we come back, we want to follow up a little bit. We've been talking about Boeing for a couple of episodes, and I want to follow up on their storyline and what's coming up next with Boeing. They're planning to take out a $10 billion loan. It looks like they're working very hard to repair their reputation. What's going on with this loan? How are they going to spend it? Do we think that it's going to be effective? Hang with us after the commercial break, and we'll be right back.
The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Travel Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back. You are listening to the GSMC Business News Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. For the last time today, my name is Maya. Thank you so much for sticking with me through today's show. I hope that you have found all of our information to be interesting today. I love to hear from you guys, so if you would like to leave a comment for me on the website, I would be more than happy to take a look and hear what you guys have to say. So we just talked a little bit about the CES, that is the Consumer Electronics Show of 2020, which just recently took place. And we talked about a couple of the very exciting new cars that were presented during the show. So now I want to talk a little bit about Boeing. Like I said, we've been watching Boeing for a couple of episodes and just keeping an eye on what they're doing because they've had so much drama going on recently. After the fall of those two 737 MAX jetliners, we had a kind of a fallout from Boeing when they replaced their CEO recently and have had a couple of different things just going up and down all over the place. So at this point, we are looking at a $10 billion loan that Boeing is about to be borrowing. That was reported from Reuters. And it looks like they're trying to essentially borrow before things get bad, because as of right now, they're actually doing fine as far as numbers go. But of course, it's always a good idea to borrow before the situation becomes dire. If anybody has ever tried to loan money before, it's best to do it before you can't. So I think that's what they're really trying to do at this point. But what are they going to do with the money, and do we think this is going to be effective? So the first thing that we think that they may be doing with at least part of this $10 billion loan is to help aid some of their suppliers. That is the companies who provide the parts for the 737 MAX jetliner. As of right now, it is no longer in production, but they do want to get the 737 back into production as soon as possible. However, when they halt the production of this jetliner, it affects all of those who help produce parts to go into the plane. So, for example, General Electric provides the engines for the MAX 737. And this halt in production will set them back by about $400 million for every quarter that production is halted. So it's possible that Boeing will be helping to at least provide them with maybe a little cushion while they wait for production to come back. Maybe they're making prepayments on some of those parts. That is all a possibility. But essentially the goal might be to help keep their supply chain in good standing so that they can continue forward with a good business relationship in the future when or if the 737 MAX comes back. The second thing that they may potentially be using this money for is to, kind of in the same sense as keeping their supply chain happy, moving forward into their business, since they're kind of a middleman in this process. It looks like they may be putting some money towards keeping their airlines happy. For example, some confidential deals have already been made between Boeing and Southwest Airlines and American Airlines, but it looks like they are essentially trying to compensate for the lost sales and lost seat capacity due to the postponing of the 737 MAX production. So it looks like they actually wanted to try to get the 737 back out by the end of 2019, but obviously it's already 2020, so we are behind on that schedule, and it's looking like at least another 6 months before the 737 is coming back. So that puts us potentially at the end of 2020 before we can have those planes back in the sky. So they are potentially looking at just keeping the airlines happy in the meantime. And the final thing that the money may be used for is just to maintain their dividends. Cutting dividends are a very big deal because it affects their investors so strongly, but they are not at that point yet. So it's possible that they're just trying to maintain their dividends in the meantime. So essentially what this money is going towards, $10 billion, is just keeping everybody happy. They're just trying to kind of save face in the meantime while they work on getting production back on the line. They work on obviously having their new CEO take over and start to move things in a different direction. They're definitely working on a reputation mending process, which is definitely the most challenging aspect of this. I mean, you can handle money all day long, but when it comes to reputation, this is pretty damaging what happened with Boeing. So hopefully they're able to get everything back and moving the way that it should. We'll take a look at it. We'll keep following up with Boeing as we move along and see how they do. So I hope that you guys have enjoyed the show for today. I have greatly appreciated having you all here. If you have any comments for us, any questions, I am always happy to take a look at those on the website. And as always, thank you so much for listening to the GSMC Business News Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I would like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice review. That really helps us. Also, if you can please follow us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of your day.
You've been listening to the GSMC Business News Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type GSMC into your favorite podcast app to find all of the shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, from business news to weird news. Please subscribe to the podcast and follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's podcast.